Okay, can I start? Uh, Namaste and good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you in the first session of this GLU second conference. I would welcome all of you in this beautiful Kathmandu. As Brother Shankar and Chandradev Bhatt already said that this is the very good and pleasant weather of Kathmandu. You can enjoy with your this visit here. As a host country's members, if you have any problem during in this your visit, you can personally contact with me. If anyone want to stay more here, I can support you. Just for your information, I am saying this. So we already running out of time. So without any delay, I would like to start these first sessions. This session's topics or themes is that impact of the COVID pandemics in the today's world of work. Brothers and sisters, we have been witnessing the very terrible situations during the COVID times here. Many thousands of workers have left their jobs. We are compelled to remain at the home due to the lockdown. Many industries are closed now. Peoples are not taking the facility from the government and other authorities. So it is, we want to, personally, I can say that I want to forget that situation. You know that for the just 5 kilo of rice, we have seen that the serpentine queue in the street. It was the very terrible scene. We have seen that. So now we are going to discuss about what we have seen, we have faced during the pandemic. Pandemic means not only COVID here. Pandemic like natural disasters like flood, climate change, forest fire are all hampering the workers' life. Apart from this, now happening in old Russia and Ukraine war severely affected the supply chain systems, which ultimately affected the workers' life. So how can we tackle these critical situations which hampering the workers' livelihood? So we will discuss about these issues now. So for this purpose, we have a very distinguished personality here. As an academician, intellectuals, trade unionists, and researchers, what they have seen and what they have suggested for our labor movement and labor welfares. So now I will introduce first our panelist here, Sir Christopher Scherer, Professor of University Kassel, Global University, is with us. Welcome, sir. Like this, Besna Nuan, Program Manager, APIDA Cambodia, welcome you. Likewise, Kanak Kumar Burman, Organizing Secretary, Jatiya Shramik Jyoti, Bangladesh, welcome, brother. Likewise, Aparna Roy, Administrative Coordinator, Asia Floor Wage Alliance, India, welcome, sister. Likewise, here our brother Bidur Kargi, President, General Federation of Nepalese Trade Union, G Fund. Welcome, brother. Bidur Kargi is contesting the proportional candidates of the upcoming national general elections. I wish him all the best for his success. Definitely, his success will give us the great mileage for trade union movement. So after these introductions, without any delay, I'll give the time or this floor to our distinguished personality, our Sir Christopher Scherer, for your presentation. Thank you, sir.
Hello, everyone. It's me again. I prepared some PowerPoint slides. I'm not quite sure how it really works. My talk will be about the global exploitation chains. They're usually called supply chains, value chains, and so on, but we do know that workers are exploited along the chain, and also smallholders and so on. And so I'll give you a little bit of an overview and how that exploitation shows itself, and then I move into how perhaps there are certain changes in the global exploitation chains. And then I move towards the issue of war, because I believe the war going on now, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, is extremely important for the future. And for the future also of globalization, how that plays out. And we don't know how the war ends. I hope it will end very soon, but we don't know that. So I'll try more to explain how it comes about that and how that war may be related actually to globalization. There we go. The picture is from the famous arts exhibition at Kassel every 5 years. Those who had been to Kassel know a little bit about it. It's a major art exhibition. And this was part of an Indonesian contribution to the arts exhibition, and that's why I wanted to show it. And these are not real bananas, as you can see. They're all handmade in ceramics there. Let's move on to the key. Here, as an introduction, supply chain is very complex, even for simple things like mangoes, you know, that. And you can imagine how complex they become if you go into IT. We can then move on. That was just a little move on to the next one. Yeah, and here a friend of us at Natal in Brazil, they did a wonderful study on who gets what, and you see at the very bottom the field workers get extremely little out of the selling of melon to the United Kingdom. But what is also interesting is that the supermarket also doesn't get so much out of it, but once the supermarket slices the melon, then the value added is all with the supermarket. But it is not value added, it is value extracted. We can move on. Here I show you that the metaphor of a chain might not be quite fitting. It is usually a network, because there are a lot of other actors. Also trade unions are part of that, but of course also consultants, companies, the finance institutions, and so on. So we have a rather complex system we are talking about when we are usually talking about a chain. We can move on. And here you can see that trade volume really increased in the 1990s. At the same time, the tariffs, the traditional way of protecting your local industry, have gone down. You know that. What I don't show is that something else went up. So the tariff is more the protection of those who want to catch up, while the new form of protection which has come up is the protection of intellectual property rights, and that is the protection of the first movers, of the pioneers, of the capital strong areas in the world there. And so we really have here a movement that then supports the exploitation. You know, it puts a lot of pressure on those producing things and gives protection to those who, by historical chance, and of course also by their own efforts, but very much by historical chance, were in a position to develop intellectual property rights. We can move on. Of course, one key aspect of that is that transportation costs really went down there. As you can see, an important one, that air freight, and we move on to the next one. So, and here we see that quite a number of countries are quite dependent on international trade. And of course, the smaller the country is, the more important trade is. And one of the smallest European countries, not the smallest, but one of the smallest, is Luxembourg, and it is also the richest and extremely dependent. And we see the very powerful China, but because it is a huge country, then trade dependency is much less. So we have to also to keep that in mind, that the dependency depends also very much on the size of the country there. Another aspect is that globalization is not something that goes on forever, continuously on a linear progression. But as we have seen in the past, we have seen a break in globalization, especially due to the First World War. But also then, and that's very much a down point, then the stock market crash in the United States, the Great Depression, and the Second World War there. And I just want to highlight that very briefly to say that we cannot assume that globalization, current globalization, will go on forever. There may be also reversals. That we move on. That. And we already see a bit of a reversal there, that in relationship to overall economic activities, trade is no longer outpacing. For the 1990s, we have seen that trade was outpacing overall economic activities. Now it's going down. Not very much, but it has already slowed down. And of course, COVID was also partly to be blamed. However, and that's the next slide, we see that here a more complex one, but for the last a few years, we do see that trade overall nevertheless increases. So it's not that trade is completely diminishing, the volume of trade. No, it's not. And we do also see that the new form of trade, trade in services, that's the red line you see over there, is also gaining steam. That. Moving on. Now, a key issue in recent times was that there were bottlenecks due to COVID first, very terrible for the seafarers there. Some of them were bound on the ship, and I look here at our friends from the Philippines because many seafarers are coming from the Philippines, that they were stuck on the ships then. I'm currently actually pursuing a research project on the harbor workers and seafarers of the banana supply chain from Colombia and Costa Rica to Europe. And the decent work deficit is quite pronounced, unfortunately. But what I wanted to show here with that is that the companies, of course, immediately made use of these kind of bottlenecks there and increased the prices enormously. And they used this huge profits to gobble up others. And so concentration in seafaring is increasing at a very rapid pace there. So it's basically kind of four companies that are ruling the world. However, that is also very interesting. Of course, these four companies are outsourcing everything in a way, but they are controlling the whole transportation chain. You know, they are controlling it, but they are outsourcing, and especially, of course, outsourcing then personnel recruitment there. What we do see is that things are easing up a little bit. As you see, the curve goes down in recent times, months. So trade along the sea is gathering speed again. So hopefully, if the war doesn't really come in further, perhaps prices will go down. The next one. And here there is another a little bit complex graph. It shows what might be key factors for the bottlenecks, and it tries to show here that it is the China lockdowns, because then many of the ships are coming from China, and with the lockdowns they were no longer coming. Then we also had a small hitch in Europe because one huge freighter blocked the Suez Canal for a week, and immediately already things are slowing down there. But it is also that the consumption of goods in the United States increased again. So after COVID and so on. So you see that there are certain drivers for the specific bottlenecks in the supply chain, and it is really, of course, a key part. You know, you cannot have a global production network without transportation. And our friends from ITF, of course, will say yes. That's a very important part of it. We can move on. Now, what is the response to these changes? And one is of the companies who are dominating these networks to think of reshoring that. But when we looked at the data, we saw quite a number of cases, but we didn't really see anything major changing in the overall picture. So far it is really more a few companies doing a little bit of reshoring, which means reshoring within Germany, but it is at a rather low level. The next one. Something else is the so-called nearshoring which is also much discussed in the United States to move perhaps more production towards Mexico or Canada or some other countries close by there. For Germany, of course, it's Europe there, and Europe is a key supplier for Germany. But when one looks at the data overall, also things are not yet moving at a very fast pace. So it is not that one could say here now everyone goes into nearshoring. The next slide. It is perhaps a bit more the friendshoring, a term that comes out of the United States, has been used by the trade representative and by the Treasury Secretary, friendshoring. And here one could perhaps see a movement that actually then will also show up in the data. And one is, for example, a mineral security partnership where quite a number of countries are cooperating and trying to make sure that they still have access to minerals, and that they will try to move that more towards countries that are friendly to the capitalist metropolis there. We have also exchanges on these very important resources, mineral resources for the energy transition, especially lithium and so on. And then already some plans then to support infrastructural measures there. So friendshoring could be a movement that could be a bit stronger than reshoring and nearshoring. Okay, so much about these developments. We have the next slide there, and now let's look a little bit into this issue of war and how it might be connected to globalization. Could you hit the button once more? I think there should be another part on that slide. Yeah, it comes, yeah. So, as we all know, the Russian fleet is threatening the transportation of grain. Ukraine has become a major source for grain for the world, especially for the Arabic world there, and leads to these major disruptions. And I want to couch that in a larger context. And I think capitalist competition is to be looked at. The competition, of course, drives companies to reach out, to build these global exploitation chains and then on. But there is, of course, also always a move a bit against it, because in a competition not everyone wins. The losers, or those who want to win in the future, they want to have certain protection. They use tariffs, subsidies and so on. But the winners, of course, want to keep their winning streaks. And they want to protect themselves through cartels, the concentration of capital, and, as I mentioned before, intellectual property rights there. So we have this kind of a struggle. The next slide. But usually the expansionary forces are the stronger ones, and here we can look at the power of ideas. The free trade doctrine of Ricardo, very strong among our friends in economics there, but also the friends in economics think that trade as peacemaker, that was for a long time an idea but there's also, of course, use of violence, as we remember, a very famous case, then the opium wars from the British against China. And then there are also some free riders of free trade, which I might explain in the next slide, I believe, as I remember. Yeah, here the use of violence, the opium wars, of course, the World War II was one of those. Now, after the World War, we had seen the US intervening against countries trying to protect its industries, trying to catch up there. And also more recently than the Iraq war. Oh, it's still written in German, so think of a Q, Iraq war. And of course, as you know, many other coercive means to make sure that the goods and capital are flowing. Next slide. And then there are the free riders. And here, of countries who want to catch up are quite happy that they may have access to other markets guaranteed by the capitalist hegemons there. And so they try to limit their imports. I've called that the lists nations because Friedrich List, a German who learned about protection actually in the United States, came back in the 19th century and wrote a big volume and pushed very much. And you see, most of the measures that are taken now by countries who were successful in catching up with the UK, Japan, China, also a little earlier Germany, were and are following the ideas that were put in that book of List. And one could that call a kind of a neo-mercantilist strategy of trying to export as much as possible, but shielding your own industry there. And now the next slide. And now moving that towards the issue of war. And here I have the picture of a very interesting intellectual, Kees van der Pijl, from the Netherlands, but who taught for a long time at Sussex in the UK. And he came up with two terms, which I thought quite fitting. And the Lockean heartland, coming from John Locke, kind of a big thinker of liberalism and thereby capitalism there, and saying there are Lockean heartlands where the center of capitalist accumulations, where there is a certain separation between state and business community, civil society. They have technological leadership, and they are pushing, as I mentioned also before, in some coercive ways, a liberal world economic order. And then there are the Hobbesian contender states. More or less at the same time, Hobbes was writing about the Leviathan, about the necessity to have a very strong state in order to pacify, at the time, Europe there. And among those Hobbesian contender states was my own country in the early 20th century, trying to compete with France and the UK, also over colonies and so on. And we're at that time, in a way, also a bit the periphery and caught up, and nowadays it's also part of the Lockean heartland. So it is the capitalist periphery that has the will, which is not true for all capitalist periphery countries, but who have the will to catch up, have a strong interventionist state, kind of this Leviathan Hobbesian state, control of the economy, so not a very clear separation between state and civil society, and a repressive state apparatus there. So, and now we have to see how they react and interact. And I would say that contender states usually have a belligerent or a hyper-nationalism that it becomes aggressive over time. Perhaps it's a little bit informed by the sorry history of my own country, Germany, that had this kind of hyper-nationalism, very bad for its neighbors. So, but what are perhaps the logical reasons for this nationalism? And I would say that if you want to catch up as a region, you need this kind of nationalism. You need that the population thinks as a nation that one should pitch in, that one should endure certain sacrifices in order to bring the nation ahead there. And that then leads also to a higher regard for the military and that. And then there are also specific countries, and these are the ones we are now looking at, where there is what I call a territorial logic, and very pronounced, of course, for Russia, which has so many important resources, especially gas and oil, and we are currently fretting in Germany whether we will freeze in the winter because we no longer have access to the gas from Siberia there. But as they try to catch up, they have to make sure that they control the rents the profits that flow out of the use of the resources. So they need to control that, and that needs national sovereignty. That needs, of course, the possibility, or the ability, not the possibility, the ability to defend your territory militarily. The Lockean heartlands, they have a different logic. Their logic is to make sure that everyone who has purchasing power has access to resources. And as the Lockean heartlands are the rich ones, of course they have the purchasing power. You know, that's a different logic, territorial and purchasing power. And now when we look at the concrete cases, we see that in Russia and in China, the armed forces of these countries, despite major changes, and especially in Russia, very severe changes because Russia suddenly became a very open capitalist society after the fall of the Soviet Union. They stayed more or less intact. Their image of who is the enemy also stayed a bit intact. And for China, it's a little bit less because capitalism came in a very different form, much less disruptive than in Russia, but nevertheless, it's the same military there. And certain moves, of course, from the West were reinforcing this kind of an image there. That we move on. Next slide, please. Yes. Now, as long as China was the extended workbench for American corporations and some of also Japanese and German and Taiwanese corporations, it was wonderful, you know, and for German companies selling their cars, their huge profits, wonderful there. But once the Chinese also mastered IT technologies, things are changing and they are seen as a serious competitor. And there is a huge consensus in the United States nowadays. Left and right are on the same page on that issue in the United States. Europe is a bit wavering because of course that some, and especially German corporations, were so successful in China there. And so we see in this situation that the capitalist heartland, the Lockean heartlands, are rearmament, that mobilizing also their own forces, and that we might then lead into more serious conflicts. I hope that will not happen, but it cannot be ruled out. Currently, it is more focused on, of course, on Russia, and there we need to go a little bit beyond my economistic explanation. There's probably also a lot of being wounded by the loss of the empire. The Soviet Union was an empire, and usually empires are, or the people in the empires are then nostalgic. And we all still see that in Britain there. Yes, so unfortunately we are at that point, and further ideas about how now global exploitation chains will be restructured depend very much on the outcome of that kind of geopolitical contestation there. If things stabilize again, we will nevertheless see more of the friends shoring that. And one of the key beneficiary in economic terms of that movement is probably currently Vietnam, where quite a number of companies have moved from China down to Vietnam, and we would have to see how that is also spreading then more into the Asian region. Yes, and on that note, I believe I come to the end. One more slide. Here I have two books to advertise that focus on agriculture more, but still a huge amount of humankind are in agriculture. That the one photo is thanks to Melissa. She brought me to Palawan there. The other one is from Pakistan. And the one book is downloadable on occupational safety and health, and the other one, unfortunately, not, because the small publisher was bought by the big publisher. But if you send me an interesting note that you are interested in the book, I can send it to you. That's no problem. And there is a longer chapter on the theory of power within global supply, global exploitation chain. So if you are interested in a theoretical take on the power relations in that field, then it could be of interest to you. And on that note, thanks for listening, and I give over.
Thank you very much, sir. You have nicely expressed about what factors affect the workers' livelihood. We'll more talk about this later. So now I will go with other panelists. We have only one ladies here in our panel, so I'll give the time to Aparna Roy. Sister, you have 10-minute times. Let's start.
So, good morning, one and all. And today I would like to present on how pandemic has impacted the garment sector workers and the response of Asia Floorwage Alliance, the Asia-led network of garment trade unions. Actually, what's the response of Asia Floorwage Alliance towards the impact of garment sector, impact of pandemic on garment sector workers. So, can you change the slide? So before beginning, I just wanted to introduce my organization. The Asia Floorwage Alliance was founded in 2007 as an Asia labor-led global labor and social alliance across garment-producing countries such as Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka, and consumer regions USA and Europe for addressing poverty-level wages, gender discrimination, and freedom of association in global garment production networks. So, going into the introduction. So, as you all know, Asian garment production countries have relied on global apparel supply chains as a pathway to economic growth and development for the past several decades to generate employment and poverty wages that would lift millions of wage-dependent populations in Asia out of poverty. The garment industry has created approximately 60 million jobs globally, with the majority of these concentrated in Asia. However, it is not generated decent and good quality employment for the majority of its workforce. And the pure example for this can be seen during the pandemic. As you can see on the screen, about 93% of the world's workforce resides in countries with workplace closure, and Asia-Pacific region accounted for 80% of global reduction in working hours during the first quarters of pandemic. And during this period, garment sector workers was one of the most impacted. And if you can see, there were a lot of unpaid wages for garment workers, and it remained about 1.8 billion US dollar worldwide. As per the data of ILO reports, that 200 garment factories were either closed or suspended in countries like Cambodia, and also in countries like, for example, in countries like Bangladesh, 57% of, countries like India, 57% of Indian garment workers experience wage reduction, and $3.7 billion orders are cancelled in Bangladesh. So all these examples shows that how the majority, how the decent and good quality of employment is denied for the garment workers or the majority of its workforce in the supply chain. And what's the major cause towards this? That's the question that I would like to arise here. Next slide. So in order to see the cause behind this, we have to see through the concepts to understand the power relation in the garment supply chain. And so if you can see here, there are several approaches to analyze the global supply chain. It can be through global commodity chains, global value chains, or global production network. And global production network can be identified as two, like production-driven network and buyer-driven network. And buyer-driven network, garment supply chain is a buyer-driven network where the weight of influence lies with the company that trade commodity from the manufacturing hub to consumer market. And the major actors of the garment production network are buyers, the retailers or brands mainly in high-income countries, then suppliers, who includes contractors or subcontractors who does the manufacturing part of the production process, and laborers, the workers who produce the clothes and are located mainly in the regions where there are low wages, and finally consumers who consume the products from retail shops. So the transnational corporations or the brands actually control and influence the production decisions, design, marketing, and branding. And the purchasing practices, including the sourcing preferences of brands, greatly influence the working conditions of laborers, the management and administration of the suppliers. Thus, relation between the actors in the global production network of garment sector turns into a quasi-production relationship that has least risk or legal ownership for the brands. Brands present themselves as simply buyers of garments produced in Asia, even though the contracts between brands and their suppliers are not simply contracts for procurement of garments manufactured independently by Asian suppliers. Rather, they are contracts for production of the garments based on specific quality standards for product and process, with tight delivery schedules set by brands who design, own, market, and sell these garments. And their false position as buyers of garments manufactured by Asian suppliers has severe consequences for workers in supply chains. So therefore, we can see a manifestation of power asymmetry within the garment production network. Like as Mark Anner tells, the competition among garment supply chain is influenced by pressuring down of wages and workers' rights. So going to the next slide. I also did my thesis during my study in Kassel, and one of the major finding I could find was that how the power asymmetry in the garment production network is witnessed during the COVID-19 period in different forms. And this includes three different forms: disengagement of brands, predatory engagement of brands, and non-engagement of brands. So disengagement is a response that can cause either during demand shocks or supplier shocks. So for example, responses during supplier shocks, the inability to deliver product on time or keep contractual commitments due to factory closures or lockdowns, can be in the form of switching suppliers by terminating relationships or through non-payment for orders not received on time. So for example, the disengagement that happened during the COVID-19 was either to force majeure, indefinite cancellation or postponement of already placed orders by the overseas brands, or deferment of payments, or asking for discounts on already shipped or ready to ship orders. Thirdly, buyers are not making payments for the goods already shipped or some of the shipments on hold, leaving it on ship warehouses or factories. The second type is a predatory engagement. So I would like to call predatory engagements another form of manifestation of power by buyers or brands where they are able to accumulate enough commodities and profits free of risk and at the cost of squeezing worker conditions of the laborers at the factories. So analyzing COVID-19 situation, one of the study done in India reported that 65% of the apparel exports payment worth $2 billion is deferred by foreign buyers, and buyers don't take any responsibility for the materials purchased for the produced or shipped goods. And thirdly, non-engagement or limited engagement by brands. Non-engagement is used to refer lack of responsibility of buyers on the abuses and violence over workers in the factories producing clothes for them. Such violence include gender-based violence, union bursting, violation of freedom of association and collective bargaining. So the manifestation of power asymmetry between buyer-supplier relation in the garment industry were substantiated by the buyers or brands themselves through the disengagement, predatory engagement and non-engagement during the crisis. Next slide, please. So let's see how the asymmetrical power manifestation between, next slide, the asymmetrical power manifestation between buyers and suppliers, which further actually squeeze the bargaining power as well as wages and working conditions of workers. So how this impacted workers? First of all, through if we analyze the wage dispersal during the time of pandemic. So it was either there was non-payment of wages for the lockdown period, delay in payment of wages by like 10 to 20 days, replacement of wages with short-term loans advanced by labor contractors or employers that are repaid with or without interest, or non-payment of wages for work completed, layoffs without severance pay, partial payment of wages with government support. So for example, the study done or the report published by AFA during the pandemic shows that the regions like Ahmedabad and Ludhiana in India, the industry relies on circulatory migrant population and informal agreements between employer and employee. Here, layoffs is the strictly legal sense might not occur as the act of dismissal workers for the slightest fluctuation in the market trends has become normalized. In Myanmar, many workers have accepted wages below the wage they settled for in bipartite discussions with the factory in the fear that demanding the rightful compensation will lead to job loss. In Sri Lanka, many workers in free trade zones in the western province received only partial wages for March and April.
Sister, you have 2 minutes, please.
Okay. So I would just wanted to conclude there were two kinds of major impact on the workers. Can you just slide one more? So I can name it as wage theft. So there was a study done by AFA among 2,185 garment workers and 189 factories. And wage theft is a central aspect of the business models of global apparel brands and not an unintended result of crises such as COVID-19 pandemic. And as a result of labor exploitation during the recession, workers were deprived of their wages and most fundamental aspect of their employment in global apparel supply chains, which mediates their household access to food, nutrition, household, healthcare and education. And any loss of wages at poverty levels denies garment workers access to minimum level of consumption required for survival constituted the wage theft. And the wage theft in India happened in different forms. Like I previously mentioned, either through layoff and termination, unpaid, underpaid or forced overtime, bonus theft or social security theft by brands. So actually AFA responded towards it by demanding international brands to take responsibility for the living condition of garment workers and their families in global supply chain during pandemic, by demanding supply chain relief contribution, which means brands should pay each supplier factory 2% of the brand's total sourcing from that supply in the past 12 months. And secondly, also they developed, sorry, I'm just running out of time. Yeah. Second response was through the first Fight the Haste campaign, developed by AFA, and this is a campaign actually strategized for wage theft during the pandemic in consultation with the union partners. And thirdly, joint employer liability or joint employer strategy. Here, we developed the legal argument and strategies to hold brand legally accountable in production countries. Next slide. So another one of the major issue that caused for the garment sector workers was the gender-based violence and harassment. So through the study done by AFA, a stitching time served none has explained how fashion brands actually fueled violence in factory and beyond. So here we saw economic harm as a form of gender-based violence, underscoring how business models of global apparel brands and their actions during the pandemic induced recession. Induced recession exacerbated women workers' vulnerability to violence both inside factories and at their homes, families, communities, leading to the feminization of COVID-19 crisis. So I'm just ending it showing how actually this gender-based violence has happened. Can you go to the next slide? So cannot be seen. I can present here. So the gender-based violence actually happened. Waste theft committed by brands during the pandemic actually disproportionately impacted women workers in their supply chains. So suppliers were forced by brands unilateral cost cutting and this has reflected discrimination based on gender, caste, ethnicity, marital status, and life cycle stage. Men were most likely to be rehired post-lockdown, while the reduction in the number of work days was more severe for women, leading to disproportionate impacts borne by women. And secondly, intensification of work due to reduction of the workforce and increased targets had serious repercussions for women on the production lines. And thirdly, economic harm imposed by brands led to a ripple effect of different forms of violence experienced by women workers in their homes, families, and communities. Women were forced to reduce their consumption, take on huge debts, and sell meager assets, leading to hunger, malnutrition, and bodily neglect. Women were exposed to increased violence in their homes, including familial, domestic violence, and in employer-provided factory dorms and boarding houses perpetrated by employers and landlords and shopkeepers. So what AFA demands here is human rights due diligence. Brands must be mandated to identify and remediate gender-based violence across supply chains through liability incorporated into their manufacturing contracts with suppliers. Brands must make concrete commitments to understanding, identifying, and addressing risk factors of GBVH across their supply chains. And secondly, compensating for the gaps in employer-based social protection and services in production country. Thirdly, wage forward. This is towards enforceable wage agreements between brands and unions, and also brands and unions and suppliers. And fourthly, implementation of safe circle approach through brand agreements. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sister Aparna. You have highlighted the major issues of the garment workers, what they have faced now. Thank you so much. Now I'll go with Brother Kanak Kumar Burman. Your time is just 10 minutes. Please consider your time. Thank you. Sorry, I interrupt Brother Kanak here. Our another panelist, Brother Bidur, is very busy nowadays. He gave us his valuable and important time now. I already said that he is contesting the upcoming elections. So he has many engagement. So we would release him very soon. It would be very great help to him. So now I'll give to time Brother Bidur. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Brother Chair, for your kind consideration in this regards. I am Bidur Karki. I am Vice President of G Fund, and G Fund is National Confederation of 21 national affiliates federations, and we have all of work in Nepal, like service, manufacturing, construction, and other agriculture as well. And I would like to discuss very few, because many of our colleagues highlighted in these issues, and we are in the same platform, and we are facing the same kinds of trouble during the pandemic. And I'm quite happy to say, or because we have chance. We were read a lot about the pandemic and their effects within many decades and many times. But within this 19 to 21, we face directly, so that and such kinds of pandemic and happening this very terrible things. Now in globally or in Nepal as well, decreasing the trend and infection rate of infection and other things. And similarly, we are facing some another types of pandemic, like this dengue and other things. Now it's spreading in Nepal, and every household there are some infected person, but the death rate is not so more, just around 51% miss their life. And this is the thing now. And during this COVID period, we had a survey from National Labour Academy, and we found that this is the midterm survey that's mid of 21. At the time, we found there around 7,800,000 are job disruptions in manufacturing sectors, and similarly 446,000 in manufacturing sectors, and 404,000 in construction, and 211,000 in transport sectors, and accommodation and service, other food sectors. There were around 62,000 workers disrupted their job, and real estate and other service sector was also around 83% job was disrupted. And in this, if we see the impact of workers' life in the pandemic period, there was a huge loss of employment and income. Many of our workers, colleagues and our members and workers lose their job from, which I mentioned before. That's one thing. And second thing is that there were declining the demand also, and mismatched demand and supply, and there some demand in the consumption items, and not only the demand in the workers as well. So that there was little bit mismatch and this, and reduction of consumption also there, and also decrease that aggregate sales as well. So it means that directly affected to their personal life as well. And there some assumption during that period, there were a downfall of investment and productive employment and income also. And we feel that there is increased poverty and inequality. Now we are facing same types of that which we were expected at the time, and prolonged recession and socio-economic crisis. So during this time, not only Nepal, every country, they are facing these kinds of socio-economic crisis as well. And in given the topic, there were response of government side. I just highlight few more things regarding this. When we introduced this COVID-19, we G-Fund and other trade union colleagues, we went to government and asking for the precaution and requesting them to some activities they could do. That and then government adopted six types of strategy. That's travel restriction, testing, tracking, and tracing and treatment and togetherness. This is the just every country they did that, and several directives and executive orders, guidelines, protocols, and procedures have been issued at the time. And then other subsidies, that first level investment in the health system as well. In Nepal, first case which we found that, and then we compelled to send the sample to the Hong Kong for investigation, so that we were know that kinds of infrastructure in the health sector. And after that, gradually we developed, and every our province and every regions and every districts as well, there is the space for that investigation as well this things that they manage. That's one thing. And second thing is that secondly, effective and responses to the case lead of infected and affected persons. That's another major part taken by from the government. And third is policy action and subsidies. That's third things. But during that time, subsidies case little bit debatable conditions at the time, because some infected or needy person, they didn't get that subsidies, did not able to get that subsidies because they don't have that kinds of voting card. Because every we did an agreement with the government, it should be provided through the local authority. But in the local authority, they concentrated on the their voters only. So that time there were little bit debated, and we also discussed, and we also tried to solve that problem. And second thing that and for the subsidies process and union responses, we G-Fund itself and other our partners from JTUCC, we did first we concentrated on workplace protection for frontline workers. First we did that. And second, lobby to paid sick leave. There were some debate, leave or other. During the lockdown period, there were some problem for the leave. And some employer, they said that is beyond our control, so that we cannot able to pay during that time. This way there were some debate arised, but we faced that. And second, wage and income protection. Our our agenda was that at the time we wanted to reduce working time but not lose from the job. So this type of agenda we highlighted, and then financial subsidies. G-Fund itself and other trade unions, NTUC and other colleagues, we provided for the needy persons for some subsidies, like some food subsidies and some monetary subsidies as well as relief package, financial assistance, all the things. So for this purpose, we trade unions, we did that consultation and interaction with the government through Ministry of Labor and Social Security on the issue of employment policy. We need that because before that there were no such kinds of employment policy. Now we have such kinds of, the government addressed during that time such kinds of problem if arises, and then government should consider on that. And monitoring the relief activities in local level. That's based on our suggestion. There is a body in the local authority, and there is a monitoring monitoring mechanism in the local authority, in our local level government. And similarly, relief distribution to the members to some extent on their own. That's kind of two types of subsidies, you know. One, those who return from the abroad, and government subsidized them for their survival, one. And second, what they wanted to do, the government providing some seed money to do some extra activities or income generating activities. And third thing is that there were some subsidies in loan subsidies and other things for the such kinds of enterprises as well. So that government taken equal balancing in this regards as well. So that, and we found that there were positive, negative, both results, you know. Negative, I already mentioned that. Positive things, we achieved something, you know. Our many colleagues, they found their subsidiaries activities or alternative job, you know. Some hotel sectors, our colleague, they changed their job to the, you know, agro-based activities, so that they went back to village and starting to the poultry farm and starting to the cultivation and vegetables like that, and they change such things. And some colleague, you know, some colleague from the home-based or domestic workers, they went to the street vendors, and they starting to that kinds of business, so that there is they found that alternative job. And second thing is that we, before this COVID, we were not you know, familiar with this online other things and this e-meeting and Zoom meeting like that. And after that, we starting that things, and now we G-Fund is able to establish our you know, action room for the training purpose, and we delivering from central to all our provinces, so that we were able to establish, and we found that this is essential. So this way we have some positive things, and now again we need to do more for resilient and reinstate all things, those who are victimized and all the things. And we should concentrate it on also in the social protection for all and social protection for the migrant workers as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother Bidur. You have nicely highlighted the is picturize the situation of the COVID pandemic and the action what they have and NTUC and G Fund and other ZUCC affiliate union done during the pandemic. Thank you so much. Now I'll go with again Brother Kanak. Please, if possible, make it little short, okay?
Thank you, Purshuram, and my others panelist colleague. Basically, I would like to focus my country context on the garment sector. It's a biggest formal sector in the Bangladesh. I will. This is the picture. The garments workers movement for due ways during pandemic. This kind of picture, many picture happen during the pandemic period. Please. Introduction. Do you know Bangladesh is an emerging economic development country in South Asia, and Bangladesh economical growth, they are contributing almost 5.75 crore formal and informal sector working people, and more than 5 crore informal and others is formal sector, and formal sector in which garment sector is the biggest sector. There are 4.5 million workers involved with this sector. Workers in this sector experience a notorious form of exploitation when the global pandemic starts. Millions more were illegally dismissed, sent back home without severance pay and wages. According to a study by the Business and Human Rights Research Center, about 5 lakhs workers lost their job, wages stolen, or about $500 million. Please, next. Lockdown was suffering during pandemic. Lockdown was announced across the country when the pandemic started. Business, education, institution, and vehicle movement all are stopped. But indecency continues over the closure of the garments industry. Government says close and owner says open. In such a situation, most of the workers go to the village home. Suddenly, the factory owners sense that their decision and announced that the factory would remain open. The workers were asked to return to the factory and also threatened to leave their job if they did not attend. As a result, even after the vehicular movement was completely stopped, the workers worked 200 or 300 miles on foot for fear of losing their job. Some of them squeezed into chicken transportation vehicles, some of them squeezed into foodstuff transportation vehicle and came to the, work with difficulty in various ways. But a section of workers are unable to return to work due to health risks and they lose their job. Although the workers continue to work with health risks, workers are laid up on various pretexts. Within a few months, the number of which stand at around 5 lakhs. On the one hand, the detained workers were not getting their full wages and other benefits. On the other hand, those who were working in the factories were not paid on time, deducting wages, depriving workers of their dues began under various pretexts. Production targets were raised and more work began to be done with fewer workers. In the in a research from Hassan and Iqbal and others, there are government representative says all the factors put pressure on the workers' work intensity. The owner force workers to do more work within limited hours of work. Thus, the owner adopt a policy like with less workers get done more. Unfortunately, workers are not getting more wage for more work. Workers do not speak because of the fear of losing their job. In such a situation, the life of workers becomes unbearable, but the workers are forced to enter all the injustice due to fear of their losing job. According to research by the Business and Human Resource Center, nearly $500 million theft from garments workers during the pandemic, including wage and other benefit. It has reported that workers committed suicide due to financial inability to buy food for their children. Parents are forced to sell their newborn babies for the $25,000 and they are unable to pay the hospital bills. This is the tragedy during this pandemic situation. Responses from the government. At the beginning of the pandemic, under the condition of not laying off workers from their job, the government announced an intensive package of about 10,000 crore in two phases, including 5,000 crore in the first phases for export-oriented institutions, including garments industry, only to pay wages to workers. Even then, layoff continued. Besides, an initiative was taken to give to $2,500 taka per family for 50 lakhs families, but due to various irregularities, it was finally possible to give the 35 lakhs families. Most of these supporters of the local elected representative of the government, leaving out many of the real workers, poor people. To receive the money, a voter ID card was required, which many of the government workers did not have, and did not have, and many of those who did had it at the home village. As a result, it was not possible to them to get the card from the village house, except for the factory work, and they did not get the cash. The law was ineffective in protecting workers' rights, and DIPE was a complete failure as a law enforcement agency. The labor code was silent during this session. Response from the trade union. Trade unions were unsuccessful in uniting the workers for their rights. They were not too prepared for the challenge of protecting workers' rights at such a time, pandemic. The government employed trade union decided to cut the wages of the workers by 35%. That is, they decided to pay the workers 65%. But the trade union were not able to play effective role to ensure the full protection of 100% wages of workers. A fund of taka 1,500 crore was set up to provide the 3,000 to workers who lost their job in the garments and leather sector. Funded by European Union, due to the non-cooperation of the owners, this money has not been given to the workers till now. The trade union also could not play any effective role in holding the owners accountable. Now, what we'll do in this decision, and trade union, what kind of initiative they done this decision. Solution needs to introduce robust social protection policy, provision for supporting workers at time of crisis. Many global brands responses to the pandemic by cancelling order, halting production and refusing to pay factories. As a result, many suppliers could not or did not pay workers, leaving already improvised workers in a incredibly vulnerable position. Global brands are primarily responsible for sufferings of the workers. They are also the primary beneficiaries, make enormous amounts of profit by exploiting cheap labor. They should be held accountable to ensure living wage and social protection. There is also need to rethinking organizing model of workers in the informal sector and R&D sector because of the changing nature of production in this sector. For instance, local mobilization of workers cannot ensure justice for workers as the RMG industry is function within the global network. So, transnational labor solidarity is crucial along with local mobilization to hold buyer accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Kanak. Now, I would like to request Brother Vesna Nuan, Program Manager, APIDA, for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Chair, for giving me the opportunity. So in my, yes, when I can do, I mean, in my, in line with the previous speakers, I think this is an effort to highlight the impact of the pandemic and on workers and trade unions, and then looking into the response both from the trade unions and the government as well. So so I mean just because I don't have the kind of outline of the introduction in this, so I'm kind of going beyond at a country level, try to cover the situation in different countries in the regions, particularly in Asia, but even more so in Southeast Asia, you know, where the information is available. This is not to say, you know, there may be some countries which are not covered in the information covered, but does not mean this situation there may not be severe or anything. It's just because of the probably information availability. And then so the structure of this short presentation is just to look at the situation in the region, in particular the labor market, the world of work, and then try to focus on the impact of the pandemic, particularly on the enforcement of the trade union rights, worker rights, and you know and also on the response side. I think little with the government side, but also for the fact that you know the government for sure across the different countries you see the different intervention in the form of the monetary and policy form. But and of course, you know, across the board, different countries, government kind of increase their support on particularly financial support to the worker. But at the same time, the government has also used the pandemic as an excuse to pressurize trade union and descendant at the country level as well. And that's, I think, where my kind of information sharing would be focusing on, like little on the state, but rather to say, you know, the state has misused this and, you know, using the pandemic in their favor, and, you know, increasing dictatorship and you know, pressurization of human rights, but also particularly on trade unions and the workers who probably have reacted the most during the pandemic. So a bit of the context, you in the, this is a center of labor force in the whole world. A lot of, increased precarities and informality in the regions, and of course, is a weak labor governance. It's a center of weak labor governance across the countries, in the regions, and therefore, many of the workers are either unregulated, either unprotected, or either abused even more so in the during the pandemic. And of course, this country also are the major production agents for the global supply chain, and you also see a trend of increased integration into the global supply chains, and which mean a lot of actors in the world, in the labor market, in the trade, would be very much related to this as well. Next slide, please. Yes, already mentioned about the substandard, which is a norm in the region. And of course, it's issue of migration, because a different level of development also, in some countries would attract, have attracted illegal migration from different countries. So it's also a center of labor migration, which we know is a lot of exploitations, a lot of unregulations, a lot of abuse in the sectors, and this is where, I mean, the relevant questions that probably our intention, which is to probably make them organized, to increase organized as a response to the severities of the abuse, and as even more so in the pandemic period, and even more so, their power, the power through different ways, and one of the ways is to the representative role in the political arena, and that's probably some of the encouraging news that some of the trade union and labor leaders have won the election in their countries, and therefore it gives probably a more advantageous position for labor in this country as well. And that's yes, in this one, yeah, I would say in the Southeast Asia, a lot of issue we have seen on, particularly during the pandemic period, that you see, we see the new development of restrictive law in different forms. We just cannot articulate well enough because of the so many different forms. But in totality, it is a kind of using legislative reform as a way to to make gains for the government and employers at the expense of the of trade unions and workers, and also I just have shared some of the major sources of the assessment. For example, the Global Rights Index of the International Confederation of Trade Unions, (ITUC) in 2021, which already from the report we could see that a lot of different category of violations, and there it's Asia is involved a lot. So like in fact, the prominent cases of violation, it come from the region, ranging from the right to strike, the right to collective bargaining, unionization, even registrations, and union busting is also prevalent in the region. Next one, please. Yes, just in the ITUC report highlights the severities and a lot that the fact that Asia is probably the most abusive area, like abuse area in part of the world. And then also another source of information that I have listed down here is really the different forms of the different restrictive form legislation that has developed, particularly during the COVID. And we see all of these different countries. Because of the time, I cannot go to this law, but And then also, of course, the shrinking space during the pandemic, as we can see, because of the information availability, I highlight some of the countries that came to the prominence in terms of difficulties or more difficult operating conditions for trade unions and workers. China in particular, you see the activists and lawyers and have been arrested, disappeared. Likewise in Hong Kong, which the situation has got even worse with the disbandment of the trade union confederations there, but also the crackdown on the movement, and of course using the law as a way to make the government can take control of the situation. Likewise in Myanmar, which union workers were arrested. There's a lot of killings and the militarization of the government, and then and also that a lot of protests and crackdown there. So that's also another country in the region which we have encountered. In the Philippines is also another countries in the region which we have seen that the condition has got also worsened there. There's legal detention and arrest, and again there's a more tough law developed during the pandemic as well on the anti-terror law, which even suspicion of terrorism would cause a sanction. Cambodia, the country I come from, is the same. Is on the trend of increased dictatorship, and then the government has been more repressive towards the progressive and dissent, including the trade unions, and also because the trade union have built a strong alliance with the opposition party, which has been dissolved and then try to be thrown out of the political arena. There's also the country where there has been probably one of the longest strike and the biggest strikes in the region as well, with the Nagawal casino case, which over 1 year the strike is still on the back to at the street, and then there has been international campaign against the strike. Thailand is also the situation got worse there, and got even exacerbated during the pandemic, and stronger, a lot more arrests there, and also a crackdown on activists there, on activists in the country. Next, please. Yes. So the relationship between the COVID and the trade unions here, as we can see, the rising unemployment, a shift from the manufacturing to the service sector, which is probably make it difficult for organized workers there. Sector employment relationship, and as some of the speakers have mentioned, it's a new industrial relation, and therefore the role of the trade union has been significantly impacted, which is make it difficult for trade union at the country to dialogue with the government and the employer representative, let alone the fact that they may not even have a chance now to meaningfully negotiate and then of course it's increased informalization of the economy, and then there's a gap in the legislations and even applications and enforcement as well. And that's it make it, and also the fact that the trade unions capacity to be, like, in a way it's an increased demand for trade union to act, and that which probably mean that you need more power, you need more resources, and which is the situation of the union is probably the opposite as well. And there we have higher demand, as I said, from the society to get the trade unions to act, while the trade union that is in the just shown on the union membership is probably on the declining side worldwide, but in particular in Asia as well, and probably even more declining during the COVID. I mean, at least from the country I come from, the number of the member has declined, and like both the number, but also the Jew collection has also made make it very difficult during the period as well. And my last, yes, and then of course on the response, to be short, like you know, I already mentioned that the state have made reaction from trade union and NGO. Even during the COVID period, you would see also reaction from look at the different countries that the trade union have also tried to react and try to build alliance with civil society organization as well. Because in some countries, as you say, you know, they may not want to be singled out for an actor against the government, and they rather build alliance with the trade union. And then, of course, there's an effort to organize in the informal, you know, the platform economy, platform workers sector is probably a good example to look into, which we see some of the reaction, like in Indonesia, you know, the transport gig worker would protest it for better support. And of course, my last part is that you know, the innovation, probably organizing has been in some part has been you know, like leadership, leaderless react protesting, for example. It's probably a new strategy, for example, and then. Yes, and I try to, yeah, I mean, again, lastly, is in this effort, you know, it's much more difficult operating condition for worker and trade union and civil society organization. We experience increased anti-union practices from employer, but also repression and crackdown from the government unlegitimately. And then there has been, of course, I already mentioned about, you know, I mean, you know, there's still some hope there. There has been some emerging, encouraging struggle. You know, there's a continue to fight. There's some development with maybe due diligence law, for example. Some of the actors in the global supply chain, there's probably, you know, potential to engage them in the interest of trade union worker. And then maybe some small wins at the country level, which we need to highlight and look into, like a kind of give inspiration for trade union. So I also think that sharing experiences and strategies, you know, networking, building, providing support, which is become critically important in this period. You know, giving solidarities and amplifying the voices of the marginalized one. You know, to hold the state into account, to hold the corporation, you know, the employers at the country would be very important to do so. And finally, it probably there is a need to revolutionize the you know, the bilateral multilateral agreement, the supply chain actors, you know, to make them more accountable, more responsible, to make their instruments stronger with the focus on worker rights, but also the monitoring and enforcement to materialize the intention of the policy. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. We have heard from the panelists. Now we have already crossed our timeline and finished the given time. So very sorry. I'm not saying sorry, but I think it's very injustice to not given the time to the floor. So I request to the floor that you have specific point, any story about pandemic, any experience, please 1 or 2 persons, please give. After that, we will finish these sessions. And thank you. Floor is yours, please. Please. Please make it very short. I'll read.
I just want to highlight one topic that I think we are a little bit missing about you know, situation of informal workers during the pandemic. And first, I would also like to thank Aparna for bringing the gender issues. I was afraid that the gender issues would miss out from these presentations, but you also brought the intersectionalities, how there, the issues like discrimination around the caste is also there in the garment sector. And I would like to say that in India and also South Asian country, we still have such, you know, the practices, the certain work is associated with the religious identity, and cleaning sector is one of them, the sanitation work is one of them. And the sanitation workers really faced a lot of issues during the pandemic. We experienced, we were introduced a concept like social distancing during the pandemic, but these workers, they have been facing these issues since long, since the ages, and they face a lot of issues during the pandemic. Some people who thinks who kind of follow the concept of purity and impurity, and certain segment of the society really associated with the kind of impure work, because they are considered as coming from they are not coming from the upper strata, they are from lower strata, and their work is to continue these practices. Their work is to take care of this impure work, and some issues regarding the safety was always have been there. They didn't get the safety equipments, and even the data is missing, like how many sanitation workers died during the pandemic. And I think when we talk at international level about the precarious work and informal work, I always observe that such kind of precarious work always has been neglected, and we should really consider it. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, brother Vishal. Very sorry to I compelled to stop in this session here because we already running out by time. So this is the time for lunch, brother Tilak. So we can talk about during the lunch time in these topics. So thank you very much for panelists, and thank you very much to Floor for your attentions. So we have to, I wish we able to tackle and face the challenge, upcoming challenge like pandemic, like others. So we have to ready for this. Trade unions always face every challenge. That could be bureaucratic challenges, political challenges, natural challenges, or pandemic challenges. So we have to ready for that. So finally, I would like to say, may long live the trade unions and labor movement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. For housekeeping note, we really request your cooperation, 15-minute consideration. So we are we will come back here on 1 o'clock, 1:15, 13:15, because our one speaker is joining from Zoom, and he's in US, and he's there waiting us. So for your consideration, 15 minutes. Thank you.